I'm particularly delighted because when I was on the faculty at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio, I was on the faculty at the School of Professional Psychology, but also the medical school. And we had to fight for 5 minutes worth of classroom time. To be able to have this extended amount of time is an absolute delight for me. I want to try to introduce you to an idea, show you a concept, and that is that there are myths about these children whom we call gifted and talented, and in fact, a lot of these gifted children are being incorrectly diagnosed as ADHD, Asperger's, even bipolar disorder. And I'm going to try to fly through some concepts, but you have a handout that will give you more information, more detail about these. How I came on this, at Wright State University, we had a School of Professional Psychology, and we trained doctorate-level psychologists. And as we started this school, we were underway about 2 years. There was a national situation that you may recall. A young computer whiz kid back in 1981 named Dallas Egbert was an early entrant to Michigan State University at age 16. Very bright fellow. After just a few weeks at Michigan State University, he disappeared. No one could find him. In addition to his passion for computers, he had a passion for Dungeons and Dragons. People suspected that perhaps he had gotten caught up in some game in the tunnels that were under Michigan State University, but they couldn't find him. He disappeared. Finally, his parents hired a private detective. There was nationwide publicity. Where is Dallas Egbert? This private detective found young Dallas working in Louisiana in the oil fields as a gopher, as a roustabout. Brought him back. He clearly was not a happy camper. They hooked him up with a psychiatrist who had not received much training about gifted kids, and unfortunately, young Dallas suicided. Now, I never knew this young man, but after his death, his parents, through a mutual friend, contacted me and said, where in the country is there a place that focuses on social and emotional needs of gifted and talented children? And no one had ever asked me that question. I had been around for a while, and I knew a lot of places that focused on the educational aspects, but not on the family, social, and emotional. As a matter of fact, when I got my doctorate, when I went through my training, the professors, we had some coursework on gifted kids, but it was about 1 clock hour worth, which focused primarily on the Terman studies, the longitudinal research, and on the methodology. Then in the last minute or two of that hour, the professor said, oh, by the way, what the Terman study showed was that gifted kids don't have any special problems. They'll make it on their own. A bright mind will find its own way. And besides that, once you get to IQ about 130, you can rack up your Binet kit because it doesn't matter how bright they are beyond 130. And that was all I got as training. Well, anyway, with Dr. and Mrs. Egbert, the parents of Dallas, they wanted to establish a little program, which we did at Wright State University because they wanted to have a little program. And frankly, my dean, as we talked, we thought it would be in a corner or closet, a back room somewhere, a very small program. A few months later, I got a call from the Egberts saying the Phil Donahue show had contacted them, wanting them to be on to talk about social and emotional needs of gifted kids, particularly suicide and depression. And they had agreed with 2 caveats. First, that they could talk about this new program that we had called SANG, Supporting Emotional Needs of Gifted. And secondly, that I be on with them. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. I've never been on national TV before. So we went. And it was a fascinating experience. I met several other families from around the country who had kids where there were social emotional problems. And what was even more astonishing was that after the show, over 20,000 letters came in from around the country, pretty uniformly saying, yeah, there's a problem, and no, there's nothing else out there. So we really began to redouble our emphasis on SANG, supporting emotional needs of gifted, which has now, by the way, morphed itself into its own 501c3 nonprofit. But in the course of this, as we began training students, and actually I should, let me right now do a disclosure here. I'm going to leave that up and tell you why and how this came to be. As we started in our training with psychology graduate students, working with families, what we began seeing was a large number of gifted kids being referred to us where someone, psychologist, pediatrician, family practitioner, teacher, someone had raised the question, you know, this kid is just not fitting in with the classroom, is not fitting in with peer relations, has these major mood swings, is so incredibly strong-willed, we're in power struggles, and so they had given a tentative diagnosis of oppositional defiant disorder, OCD, Asperger's, ADHD, and the like. We began seeing that no, it was gifted kids, most of whom were academically misplaced or had parents who were not informed about the characteristics of gifted children, that there was a lot of misdiagnosis. So we wrote a couple of articles published in peer-reviewed magazines, but then decided that there needed to be a book written or more. And so we approached some of the larger publishers, and they said, we're not interested, too small a niche. Besides, gifted kids don't have any problem. And so after I retired from Wright State University, my wife says I have a terminal infection of missionary zeal, and I tell her there are worse things to die of. But since there was not a publisher interested, we then formed our own publishing company, Great Potential Press, which I'm president of, and four others and I wrote a book called Misdiagnosis, and I am author, and I do get a salary and royalty. I can't exactly go to Mexico on that, but that's okay. The more important thing is SANG, the nonprofit. And we establish, as you do with any new idea that's not yet widely accepted in the field, you first try and approach people who have reputations to say, does this make sense to you? So we formed this professional advisory committee to try and get the attention of pediatricians, family practitioners, psychologists, psychiatrists, and the like. And this group is still in existence and is working avidly. As a matter of fact, we have just completed the first phase of a nationwide survey of parents about their experiences with pediatricians, saying, in your working as parents with pediatricians, how often did you talk with your pediatrician about your child being gifted? Was it helpful? Did the pediatrician seem knowledgeable? And the like. We are just beginning to analyze those data. But what's showing up already is that, yes, that's where parents turn. Big surprise. And actually, what's pleasant is that most of the parents are saying about half the time we have brought up the issues of giftedness with the pediatrician, and they were helpful. Well, you can look at it as a glass half full or half empty. For me, I'd like to have more healthcare and counseling professionals be more knowledgeable and more helpful. The issue, though, that we have to start with is what is gifted. And I imagine that how many of you have had much training about gifted kids? Okay, a couple of hands, which is about what I expected. And I'm going to fly through some of this, by the way. Back in 1972, the Fed government, for the first time, defined gifted as saying gifted kids are those youngsters who have unusual ability or potential for that ability in one or more of these areas. And actually, they originally included psychomotor ability, giftedness. And we know there are gifted athletes. Bucky Badger would certainly agree with that. But that's since been deleted because folks have recognized that athletes are pretty well taken care of. Unusual ability or potential. Well, how unusual? It's how long is a piece of string? And it's arbitrarily. The field said, okay, we're going to say the upper 3%, IQ 130 and above. To mirror image, the lower end that we call mentally retarded, IQ 70 and below, are used to call mentally retarded. And that's frankly what most of the schools in the country still use. However, with this, I want you to notice something offhand graphically. Although this is not an equal interval scale, it's not too far from that. Look at these kids are as far above average as these kids are below average. And the case I'm going to make is they're fundamentally as different in many ways. What also I want you to recognize, though, is on this tail that although 130 is a cutoff, it keeps going on up. And when you get up here, you're talking dramatically different. One of the problems I have in the gifted child field and am spending a lot of time talking about is how often we treat gifted kids as though they're a homogeneous group. You'll see the literature, 30 gifted kids were compared with 30 non-gifted kids, like it's an either-or thing. I mean, give me a break. What kind of gifted? How much? At the very least, you have an issue of range. I often talk to people about you have the borderline gifted, the average gifted, the profoundly gifted, and the terminally gifted. And these kids who are way up there are just different from the garden variety gifted kids. As a matter of fact, if you see this little yellow here, there's some good research indicating that there are far more, probably 5 to 10 times as many kids in this 145 to 160 range as you would expect if the normal curve were in fact true. These are more often born to mothers over the age of 40, go figure, more often left-handed, and in addition have a significantly higher incidence of asthma and allergies. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Now, more recently, however, there has been an expansion of the definition of gifted to say, 3 to 5%. First of all, it lays us open to the charge of elitism. You're taking a specially favored few and giving them more, and they didn't need it anyway. But the National Association for Gifted Children established a committee. I was on it. Over a couple of years, we looked at this and said, no, it makes more sense to think of gifted as the upper 10%. And what we're basing this on is several things. First, just normative experience that all of us have known people who, as we went through school, they were bright, but they weren't what we would call gifted. But yet, as adults, they are clearly gifted, no question. That's one. Secondly, though, we looked at the work. Well, some of the popular things like Outliers, the book, Talent Code, a book called Intelligence and How to Get It, a kitschy title it's a nice book by a psychology professor out of Michigan, I think. And all of these build off of the work of Anders Ericsson. Anders Ericsson has, for his dissertation, he and his colleagues looked at outstanding behavior in all different kinds, not all, but many different kinds of areas. Music, math, chess, and the like. And what he found was that, yes, all of them were reasonably bright. But the single thing that stood out was that all of them had spent 10 years, 10,000 hours in their area. And that's what had allowed them to really become outstanding, eminent. This fits also with the more recent brain research, showing that with practice, and I'm not talking drill and kill, but with practice, you can get axon dendritic connections, added myelinization, and the like. So what we've said is, there seems to be about 120 IQ as a threshold. Beyond that, it's a matter of practice, and that implies motivation, resilience, tolerance for frustration, and the like. There are many myths on gifted kids, and I have already mentioned some of them there. They don't need anything. They've got it made anyway. You know, a bright mind will find its own way. My favorite that I hear often is, well, cream always rises to the top. Well, so does scum, for God's sakes. You know, that the regular educational system will meet their needs. No, the research indicates that most gifted children in the regular classroom, from 1/2 to 1/4 of the regular classroom time, is spent waiting for others to catch up. That they're underachieving by 2 to 4 grade levels below what they could comfortably achieve at. That they're parents, they're an easy kid to parent. No. One of the things we're going to emphasize is probably the single most universal but yet most overlooked characteristic, and fits in here, is intensity, strong-willedness. One mother summed it up pretty well. She said, "My child's life motto seems to be anything worth doing is worth doing to excess." And they do tend to be excessive personalities. If they're into dinosaurs, that's really all they want to do. If they're into chess, they eat, sleep, live chess. If they're into sibling rivalry, power struggles, underachieving, it's equally as intensely. They even sleep more intensely. And this is one that you're likely to run into. Parents will tell you that these children have more, when they're asleep, they're more soundly asleep. They're more difficult to waken. Their dreams are more vivid. We don't have good data yet, but it seems that there is a higher incidence of night terrors amongst gifted kids. But what we do have data on is there's a higher incidence of bedwetting and sleepwalking among gifted boys in particular. And the higher up in the gifted range they are, the more likely you are to see that. Well, high ability certainly is a benefit. I mean, I think we'd all agree that, yeah, it's nice to be brighter than it is to be less bright. But there are some issues that are the most frequent. The first is boredom. I mentioned the 25 to 50% of the time waiting for others to catch up. I'm sure that you have had that same experience, that you have been in situations where, you've been at parties where the only thing going through your mind was, if I have to listen to this drivel for 5 more minutes, I'm going to go crazy. Or this person is thinking and talking so slowly. Come on. And you remember that impatience. Okay. Now, the same is for gifted kids. Underachievement goes along with this. I mentioned the gifted kids underachieving by 2 to 4 grade levels, and actually what we find is that schools are teaching gifted kids to underachieve. Teaching kids in the primary grades to underachieve, and it goes typically like this. Ms. Harrison, your child is wonderful. She's just doing perfectly in all our classroom tests. She's a delight. I wish I had a class full of her. You have nothing to worry about. But yes, you do. What's happening, what you have to worry about is she's getting 100 on every test. And what's happening as a result is she is being deprived of the opportunity to learn frustration tolerance, resilience, stretching herself. And so what happens is these kids in primary grades go diddly-bopping along until they get to middle school, high school. For the first time, they're challenged. They hit a wall and they then fragment. As a matter of fact, there are several positive psychologists like Martin Seligman and others who have written about how our society, with the technological innovations in particular, we are depriving our kids generally of learning resilience and frustration tolerance. For example, all of us as preschoolers had to do the same task of very complicated learning how to tie our shoe. It took a long time. Now we have Velcro. And so we teach them underachievement. Peer issues. One of the characteristics that you see, and this is almost a universal, is peer issues, and the brighter the kid, the more likely there are to be peer issues. You have to raise the question, though, who's a peer for gifted kids? Because the answer is, and we're going to get to a concept of asynchronous development in a minute. You're talking about a peer in chess, or you're talking about a peer in t-ball, a peer in music, or a peer in math, or in whatever. They often need several different peer groups, and a common behavior pattern that you see is these children will, if they go out to recess, they want to play only with one child. Or often they don't want to go out to recess. They want to stay inside and talk to the teacher, or the nurse, or the principal, or the custodian, because those are more their intellectual peers than are their age peers. Parents worry a lot about this. Physicians worry about this. Psychologists say, make her get out. Make him get out and play with other kids. He's got to learn to get along with everyone. Time out. No. The research indicates, if you look at the biographies of eminent men and women, what you find is that characteristically, they spend large amounts of alone time as children. A. And B, they gravitate toward reading very, very much. They spend large amounts of time of reading. One of the books that I love is a book titled Some of My Best Friends Are Books. And they immerse themselves in reading. Now, ironically, the parents at an early age in primary grades say, make my kid get out and play with the others. But when that same kid hits junior high, they're horrified now at the peer conformity. Oh my God, OMG. My daughter has dropped out of the gifted program. She is more concerned with Lady Gaga than she is with academic achievement. And so you get this pendulum swing. Feelings of belongingness tying in with this, anger coming out of this. Now, where would anger come from? One of the examples I often use with educators is, have you ever been to an in-service where you really didn't want to be? Of course. Now, imagine you have to go back to that same in-service tomorrow, and then the next day, and then the next day. And it's about as exciting as a wart. And you're just, you get a low-grade mad, the anger. But sometimes, particularly when gifted kids, as often happens, are criticized for the very things that make them what they are, there's anger. What I mean by criticizing what they are is, you're way too intense. You're way too sensitive. Do you have to question everything? Can't you just once do it? Why can't you be like all the other kids? What I'm saying is, I would like you a lot better if you just were different. And there's often the power struggles with the parents, particularly that intensity of gifted children, who often come from gifted parents who themselves are intense, and power struggles. About 1/3, maybe a little bit more, of gifted children are perfectionists. And in their minds, with their intense feelings, tend to catastrophize. The perfectionism, now, there's nothing inherently wrong with perfectionism. I tell people these days I'm getting to the age where I have to think about when I have my stroke. When I have my stroke, I want a perfectionistic neurosurgeon. And you do too. You don't want someone who's going to say, oh, it's good enough, close him up, right? So what's the problem? Well, with these kids, what happens is, at their age, particularly, they get paralyzed by perfectionism. It becomes an impairment. They will work for days and weeks on a problem, and then on a project, and then on the way to school throw it in the dumpster because it's not quite perfect. They would rather take a 0. Implied in that is the idealism that you characteristically see in in gifted kids generally. Misdiagnosis we're going to talk about more. Then health and behavioral problems. These are some that we've pulled out. Allergies and asthma. We know from working with parents And from this is some good research by Benbow and Lubinsky out of Nashville, Peabody College. Higher incidence of allergies and of asthma. Amongst profoundly gifted, about a 70% incidence of asthma. Don't know why. Bedwetting, sleepwalking, I've mentioned, but one that we are calling, for lack of a better term, reactive hypoglycemia. And I can only partially explain it to you, but I'll talk to a group like this, and I'll describe a behavior pattern and ask for a show of hands, and it comes out repeatedly to be about 8 to 10%. These are kids who show a behavior pattern like this. They go to school eager, intense, curious, can't wait to get there. They're wonderful to be around. They're exhausting to be around, but they're wonderful. And they're on task, good social reciprocity and the like, until about 10 or 10:30, and then in the space of about a half an hour, they have great difficulty staying on task. They're highly distractible, very emotionally labile. You make any kind of slightly critical comment and they have a meltdown. They're just a mess. And they're pretty much that way until about a half an hour after lunch. And now, back on task, long attention span, social reciprocity, give and take. They're wonderful until about 3 or 3:30, and then wham. What seems to be happening is these kids are just running out of fuel. The research indicates, as you know, that for all of us, our brains are the biggest consumer of glucose in the body. We know that. But the more recent research, and this is primarily, I'm going to blank on the name, I think it's the IDs. Brock and Fernand have summarized the research. The brains of gifted kids, particularly the brighter ones, their brains consume more glucose than that of other kids. So what we found ourselves recommending after consulting with pediatricians, we always tell parents in the CYA thing, consult with your personal physician on this, but to put them on a mid-morning snack, mid-afternoon snack that's high protein, moderate carbohydrate, and preferably no sugar. So beef jerky at 10, peanut butter crackers at 2, and you see, and this is the important thing, behaviorally you see an immediate leveling out that day. It's dramatic. This affects about 8 to 10%, particularly of highly gifted. Usually they're slender of build. And it is dramatic, except out of those 8 to 10%, about half of them are also going to have allergies. So now the beef jerky has to be without preservatives. It can't be peanut butter, it has to be soy, or has to be almond. Or it can't be a cheese stick unless it's an organic goat cheese. I mean, it's hinky. It's really idiosyncratic. And these are going to be parents who will tell you how often they have to cut the tags out of the back of the shirts of the gifted kids and how overreactive to stimuli these kids are. These also are going to be the kids who are particularly likely. I'm basing this not on formal study, this is on case study and the like. But these are kids who are idiosyncratic in their responses to medication. And we're trying to get some folks to look at this more thoroughly, but they're the sorts who this kid, a little bit of medication is, wow, way more than you would expect in terms of the effect. The next kid, it's going to take a whole bunch more. You get a much more of a idiosyncrasy is all I can say. Existential depression is one that you will see when you get to particularly high school age, but it can occur before. And these are kids who feel alone in an arbitrary Kafkaesque absurd world where they look around and they say to themselves, can I make a difference in this world? Can any one person make a difference? I feel alone. No one really understands me. And they're the Dallas Egbert kind. Expectations of others, that's always an issue. What's appropriate to expect of a gifted kid? Particularly with a concept that we call asynchronous development. You know, most of us have been taught that if you're in this area, if you're at this level of ability in this area, let's say math, you expect other areas to be pretty similar. And that's true. for average and below average range kids. Once you get into the above average, particularly as you get into go up the gifted range, the higher you get up intellectually, what happens normatively is there is an increasing span of abilities. And so you may have gifted kids, not surprisingly, you will have gifted kids who are functioning, let's say they're age 6. In math ability, they're functioning like a 12-year-old. In English ability, more like an 8-year-old. Fine motor ability, more like a 6-year-old. And then judgment will be at their age level or slightly ahead of. That's one of the biggest asynchronies, is that judgment lags behind intellect. You have a child who's 4 intellectually is like an 8-year-old, socially, emotionally, judgment-wise, that 4-year-old's going to be like a 5-year-old or 4-year-old. And it's very frustrating for parents, and it's why they end up saying to themselves, they find themselves saying, for someone so bright, you have no common sense at all. You're so bright. How come you forgot your homework 3 times this week? Well, the judgment lags behind intellect. The brighter the child, the greater the gap. That's the bad news. I always tell people the good news, though, is with each passing year, judgment does catch up to intellect, about age 50, 55, something like that. Here is actually a face sheet of a Wechsler. I'm only halfway jesting on this because this giftedness is not something you outgrow or get cured of at age 18. And there are some books now written on gifted adults that are fascinating. Here's an old whisk as a face sheet to demonstrate the asynchrony. The subtest here, this is average range, MR, gifted. Notice on these, here's this kid clearly gifted. As a matter of fact, there's 1, 2, 3 of the subtests hit the ceiling on. He's brighter than the test measures. How much brighter? Don't know. Test doesn't go that high. But look down here, here's an area, he's not gifted. Oh, here he's only average. Only average. This is a kid who would be gifted and functionally LD. I'm highlighting this concept because you will find schools that say you can't be gifted and LD. They're oxymoron. Yes, you can. You actually can, although this is more the functionally, because the school will say, well, what's the problem? Everything's at grade level expectancy. Well, yeah, that's true. What the problem is that this kid is at issues going to have issues with self-esteem, will underestimate his ability, and likely underachieve because, like all the rest of us, he will evaluate his ability not based on what he can do, but based on what he cannot do. I don't know why people think I'm so bright. I mean, yeah, I'm 10 and I can do calculus equations in my head, but I'm having trouble spelling. I'm just average. I mean, anyone could do calc. You could do calc in your head if you wanted. It's easy. It's easy for me because I grew up seeing the world through my eyes. Does that make sense to you? So they will focus on what they cannot do. Once parents understand about the asynchrony and sometimes the need for a good neuropsychological assessment to find out, they can revise their expectations, stop beating up on the kid for things that are lagging behind, and do some cognitive retraining in many instances. So, but these are kids who, educational placement-wise, are the ones that drive administrators and teachers to drink, because these are the kinds of kids who often need several different educational accommodations. They will often need whole grade skip, combined with single subject acceleration, combined with grouping and regrouping in the classroom, combined with remedial tutoring in an area. Oy vey. Can you see? But yet that's what they need if they're really going to develop their potential. Now, the next concept I want to introduce to you is, and if you took nothing else home from today, this is what I'd want you to take home. Back in, been over 50 years ago, a Polish psychiatrist and psychologist named Kazimierz Dabrowski came up with a theory. The overarching theory is the theory of positive disintegration, which makes sense out of existential depression. What he said is that bright folks who observe and question the world begin noticing the inconsistencies, the hypocrisies. They go through a period of disintegration, And that's a necessary step to reintegrate at a higher level of idealism. Makes sense. But what he noticed also, and a key part that has made so much sense in the gifted child world, helping us understand the intensity and sensitivity of gifted children, is the part of his theory that he called the overexcitabilities, where he built off of something that we've known for centuries, namely when any kid comes into this world, every child has an inherent attraction to stimuli. They're excited and drawn to the world around. We know that. They're drawn to lights, colors, taste, touch, so forth. What he noticed, though, was as the brightness level increases, the more the excitability, such that it becomes an over-excitability. This intense being drawn to stimuli. And he said, then broke it down into 5 different areas. He said, first you have an intellectual overexcitability. These are the kids inquiring minds want to know. They just consume information. And they love puzzles. It's almost an emotional thing for them to have Sudoku or puzzle or reading books. Then you have the imaginational overexcitability. These are the ones who spend so much time in daydreaming. They use animistic thinking, where they imbue feelings to inanimate objects. Like these chairs probably are already getting tired from you sitting on them. And they're off in this world, the drama queens, if you will. Then you have the emotional overexcitability, and parents will tell you about their youngster who can't watch the evening news without crying. The youngster who wants to pick up the homeless man. Or, true story, this mother who told me about driving her 10-year-old to the dance lesson, and the 10-year-old said, "Mom, please slow down." "But honey, we're going to be late." "I know, Mom, but we're killing bugs on the windshield, and I've seen too much death for someone my age." True story, but this incredible emotionality. Then a psychomotor overexcitability, and this is one that gets misdiagnosed often as ADHD. These are the kids who are always moving. They talk fast, they're wiggling something, they're fiddling, almost like a trichotillomania and the like. But it's not that they're off task. As a matter of fact, the more on task they are, the more excited they are, the more they're going to be moving. The brighter the child, the greater the likelihood of this psychomotor. Rapid speech, they talk faster than I can listen. And then a sensual overexcitability. And this is where you see what I mentioned earlier, the cutting the tags out of the back of the shirt. They can't wear nubby socks. There's a demonstrated hyperacuity where they hear sounds. Their hearing just seems to be better. And they are exhausted by continual loud noise, by odors. I'm really having trouble paying attention because that perfume you're wearing is wonderful, but it's just, I'm almost getting sick from it. Somehow, and we don't understand the mechanism for this, but the overall brighter the child, the more likely you are to see 1, 2, 3, or all 5 of these, and the more likely it is to permeate their life. Now, this carries on into adult life, but as they get older, they do learn to manage these in some ways. I have a colleague who told me about how he's very psychomotor overexcitable. He was tentatively diagnosed with ADHD as a kid. He's clearly not as an adult. But what he does is he wiggles his toes in his shoes because people don't see that. You'll talk to adults who they say they can pay better attention when they're doodling or when they're knitting or their hands are moving. Dabrowski overexcitability. You can begin to see how this is looking like some of the syndromes that you diagnose. So there are characteristics that you have on your handout that can prompt us to misdiagnosis. I'm going to let you read those later. Okay. I have real problems with how much our society, and particularly our schools, have gotten into giving labels. And our society, frankly, is far less tolerant of what I call quirkiness than it used to. We have, in psychiatry and psychology, looking at the DSM, a quarter century ago, there were only 80 psychiatric diagnoses. Now there are about 300. I don't think our human nature has changed that much. I think that we, in many ways, have just redefined the area. And many of these are quirks that aren't, for individual cases, are quirks, not diagnoses. Let me give you a quick case study here. Stevie, 5-year-old, very talented, very emotional, very intense. He throws himself around, doesn't want to transition from one task to another. Teacher said, need to take him to a psychologist. Now, he's had several events here in his life: car accident, Lyme disease, illness, death of his grandfather. He's rebellious in school, a strong-willedness. Teacher trying to get him to write his name. He write it only in all uppercase letters, and on the third try, he purposely reversed the last letter upside down, saying, it doesn't matter, it's boring. Vivid, creative imagination. He even brought his imaginary babysitter to school. He loves painting and classical music. He insists his mother come sit with him on the bed, and they put on a CD and listen to Strauss and pretend that Strauss is performing just for them. And he likes to dress in sweatpants. Why? Because that's what Strauss and the others wore. It's period costume. And he hums in class, kind of bothers his teacher. The administrator and the teacher said, you know, this looks like OCD to us. I think you need to take this kid to a psychiatrist and maybe get some medication. And only then will we allow him back in school next year. Fortunately, the mother began Googling, found out that, gee, you know, these are characteristics of gifted kids: perfectionism, intense reaction, so forth. So they began working with the psychologist on this, introducing the psychologist to issues that are common for gifted kids and some strategies so they could reasonably put limits on it rather than just medicate or do away with this. And his behaviors improved. Now, Stevie he's 5 years old, this far from being medicated and diagnosed with OCD. I want to show you what Stevie, what his painting is like at age 5. He just recently won a nationwide contest there. Not bad for age 5. The first landscape. He went to a Picasso exhibit, came home and did that. A chalk. Not bad for age 5, huh? And that's little Stevie. His mother, by the way, gets accused of doing the paintings for him. What are the most frequent misdiagnoses then? ADHD. And what we've lumped them together, the anger diagnoses. It's not the way the DSM does them, but they all have a common element of anger. All of these are ones we've seen. ADHD probably the most common. Think back to a gifted kid sitting in the regular classroom waiting for the other kids to catch up, and he's off task. Most gifted kids can tell you how many times their teacher clears her throat, how many holes there are in the acoustic tile. The anger diagnoses, you can see how this can lead to power struggles, which can easily be incorrectly diagnosed as ODD conduct and so forth. By the way, the narcissistic personality disorder is one we see more often in adolescents and adults. But what the psychologists and psychiatrists forget is that there is a certain amount of narcissism involved in becoming eminent. You have to have a big ego and think that what you're doing is important. And to do it sometimes at the expense of other people. Ideational anxiety disorders. Again, this is not the way DSM classifies them, but all of them have a major element of anxiety or intellectualization. OCD, Asperger's. Asperger's, by the way, was the diagnosis du jour a few years ago. I'm not sure it's quite in as much as it used to be. But what was happening is a lot of gifted kids who were the more nerdy kinds of gifted kids, when they were educationally misplaced, were getting misdiagnosed as Asperger's. Some of them were, but many misdiagnoses. Now, on the other hand, I do have to mention to you that there are some nerdy gifted kids who are truly Asperger's, and the Asperger's is getting overlooked. And on your handout, there is a checklist, a pre-referral checklist that talks about gifted characteristics, Asperger's, and what begins to differentiate them there. Bipolar. The pediatric bipolar is probably the current diagnosis du jour. And we're seeing bipolar diagnoses, kids as young as age 3 being diagnosed with rapid cycling pediatric bipolar, which to me is an egregious misdiagnosis. And often they were hospitalized, put on major psychotropics, and I'm not sure what damage was done to the kids. I severely question if you have a highly gifted kid who is, someone saying, rapid cycling pediatric bipolar. If you look at the rapid cycling specifier in DSM, they're talking about up for weeks and down for weeks, not up and down in the course of a day or from one day to the next. Usually these are the kids who are the ones I called reactive hypoglycemic, and again I'm putting that in quotes. But you're not, the reactive hypoglycemics are often diagnosed ADHD or rapid cycling bipolar, but you're not ADHD only between 10:30 and noon and 3:30 and 5, or bipolar on this. And if you change the environment, you get a major improvement. Learning disorders often overlooked because of giftedness, because what happens is I'm in your third grade class, I've got an LD, I'm missing about half of what you're saying, but I'm bright enough to fill in the gaps, so I'm diddly-bopping along, and I'm doing okay until I get to something more specific, and then all of a sudden emerges, I have an LD. Who knew? Okay. Dual diagnoses. There are some diagnoses that simply are more common amongst gifted kids. One of which is the learning disabilities, the asynchronous development, which I put up. ADHD, there is some evidence that ADHD is truly slightly more common amongst ADHD. But it becomes really difficult to tease out, are we talking ADHD gifted or both? And in terms of trying to make understanding of this, there's some recent research that indicates the prefrontal cortex in gifted kids is thinner, longer than it is for most kids. We know the prefrontal cortex is where judgment, executive function is. Okay, so maybe that's part of what is happening here with the gifted, but also that intensity. We don't have good research yet to indicate what's going on. My suspicion is that there's something happening in the limbic system, that intensity, so that even if you do have a fairly well developed prefrontal cortex, it's overriding that. I don't know. I'm hoping I can just throw this out and some one of you will pick that up and say, oh, I'd like to do some research on that. OCD, yeah, we know there is a tie-in in OCD, certainly the perfectionism, but we've known for decades as a psychologist. If you were to refer to me a patient, say, Dr. Webb, I'm sending you an OCD patient, knowing nothing else about that patient, I could say, probably has an IQ of 120 or better, and I'd be right close to 90% of the time. We have known that for decades, but it's not been really tied in with gifted. Asperger's, redefinition of high-functioning autism. Now, in the upcoming DSM, they're talking about doing away with Asperger's as a diagnostic entity. I hope they don't. I think it's a very useful one. Talked about allergies, reactive, we've already talked about those. Parent-child relationship problems. Wow. All of these, the giftedness is a component. When you're bright, I'm not going to get into those. Okay. Somewhat more detail. In LDs, we've mentioned asynchronicity is typical. Handwriting is often poor, but if you look at the DSM, you find handwriting being cited as a marker for all kinds of disorders. LD, Asperger's, ADHD, but handwriting is typically poor for gifted kids. Why? Because first, they teach themselves how to write before entering school, not because of parental pressure. But secondly, their thoughts go so much faster than their little hands can. And third, they don't see any reason for it. If you can read what I write and I can read what I write, and the purpose of writing is to communicate, why does it have to be calligraphy? ADHD, in addition to what we've already said, many of the tasks just seem irrelevant to them. I'd like to teach you about my friends, Miss A and Mr. B. Do you know Miss A and Mr. B? The gifted kids in first grade are sitting there, yeah, come on. Or why do I need to learn spelling? I've got spell check on my computer. I've got grammar check on my computer. I can do multiplication tables. They just seem irrelevant. OCD. We know that gifted kids are idealists. They can see how things might be. They can also see how things are falling short of how they might be. But remember, OCD is primarily an adult diagnosis. You will see it in adolescents, occasionally in kids. Asperger's, we've already talked about. Remember, it's on a continuum. Existential good. We've already covered some of this here. Enmeshment, though. There's one that I wanted to talk about. Single parents of gifted kids. It's very tempting if you're a single parent of a 10-year-old child who talks like a 30-year-old. It's very tempting as a single parent to share with that 10-year-old child things that are just not appropriate emotionally. Remember the lag between judgment and intellect. So please be alert to that. How do you differentiate? Does the developmental milestone history indicate precocious development? Look at the Denver Developmental Scale, and the research indicates that gifted kids as a group, on average, are 30% ahead of the others. The one area that doesn't seem to be true for is the motor development, but all the other areas, yes. Are the behavior patterns typical ones for gifted kids? What's the context of the problematic behaviors? Because what you find with gifted kids is that when they are with others who treat them with intellectual respect, the problems are greatly ameliorated. They're essentially a non-issue. Can we use Occam's razor and most parsimoniously explain the problems, behavior problems, by gifted being in an inappropriate situation? And then, what is the actual impairment? I mentioned earlier quirks. And honestly, folks, I think our society is getting more oriented toward conformity, mediocrity, and fitting in, and not tolerating of quirks. Now, I know you're not quirky, and I'm not quirky, but there are people out there that are quirky. A quirk is not a disorder. What is the impairment? Is there an actual impairment? Okay. I've got on the handouts, I've reproduced the DSM criteria. I'll just put up one of those, but I want to take a minute or two and do some questions. Here, ADHD, inattention, hyperactivity, impulsivity, 6 or more for 6 or more months. Fails to give close attention to details, sustaining attention, doesn't listen. You can imagine a gifted child being in a classroom where they're off task, at least off the teacher's task. You can look through these and see how they could as equally apply to gifted as they can to children who truly have ADHD. I will mention also one other thing on the ADHD in particular, because I see it so commonly, where a parent will bring in a child that someone's raised a question about ADHD, and the physician who has 10, 12 minutes to spend with the child, after the physician explains how the otoscope works, finally says, well, you know, he's really a curious, bright, active child. I don't know if he's ADHD or not. I tell you what, let's put him on a trial of Ritalin and we'll see. And if he responds favorably, then we'll know. Unfortunately, the research indicates that most people respond favorably to mild to moderate dosages of Ritalin. It's very similar to what most of us do as adults. We medicate ourselves with coffee in the morning, a stimulant, and it seems to help us. Certainly helped me this morning because I'm on Arizona time. But please be a little bit careful of that. And I know it's a converted preaching to the saved here, but I wanted to make sure and get that out. Now, what I've tried to do is give you just an incredibly fast overview of an area. On the handouts at the very end, there's a list of books, references, have more details, more of the summaries of the literature that exist. It is an embryonic field. More is coming out. I hope there will be even more. I'd like to stop here and see if there are questions or comments.